Hi everyone, this is Nick Brandolioni. Today we're going to do a review of some of the vocabulary around trigonomic functions. And in particular, we're going to start with the basics: sine, cosine, and tangent. And you can find that with these functions you can do a lot of powerful things, a lot of amazing things. So let me just refresh your memory on what these functions are. They're defined on the unit circle, and the unit circle is simply that of a circle with radius 1. And that makes things really, really easy because, let's take a look at a unit circle here. You can see as we move along the circumference of the circle, the right triangles that are formed move around. And these right triangles are really kind of cool. They form all the angles from 0 to 360 degrees. And it's basically the different legs, the ratio of the different legs make up the trigonomic function. So what does that even mean? Okay, so let's look at this right triangle here. So we have a base, we have an altitude, and we have a hypotenuse. And in right triangle trigonometry, those have special names. Let's take a look at these names. So what I called the base a second ago is basically called the adjacent side. What I call the altitude, we call the opposite side. And the hypotenuse is always the longest leg in a right triangle. So we have adjacent, opposite, and hypotenuse. Those are three words that you have to know. All right, what else do you have to know? That the angle that is formed in this right triangle is usually called theta, which is a Greek letter. It can be called anything. It's arbitrary, but we usually call it theta. So that would be this angle over here. All right, now let's discuss the different ratios we have. We can have the adjacent over the hypotenuse, and that is called the cosine. We could have the opposite over the hypotenuse, and that is called the sine. And then finally we could have the opposite over the adjacent. These are the three primary trig functions. There are others, of course. I went the opposite over adjacent. I could also do adjacent over opposite. And I can also do hypotenuse over opposite and hypotenuse over adjacent. Those are also trigonomic functions, but we're not going to focus on them today. They are not as important, frankly, as the sine, the cosine, and the tangent. Okay? All right. Now let's move on to how we could actually use these formulas. Well, we don't know how high it goes up. So let's label that. Now before we learn how to use these formulas, we have to remember these formulas. That we're 500 feet. They're not the most intuitive formulas in the world. And the angle that we measure, students always forget what they between the launch. I'm going to have to do this one again. We're 500 feet from where the rocket launched, and it went pretty much straight up. We're trying to figure out how high it went. Well, if the angle between us and the maximum height of the rocket is 30 degrees, we have enough information to figure that out. When you use the Pythagorean theorem, you need two sides to figure out the third. But when you use trigonomic functions, you need just one side, but you also have to have the angle, typically denoted theta. So let's see how we work this out. We know that we have 30 degrees, and we're working with the opposite over the adjacent for tangent. Okay. The opposite is unknown. We'll leave that as y, but the adjacent we do know is 500 feet. And this ratio is the same as the ratio of tangent of 30 degrees. So how do we find y? Well, let's just multiply both sides by 500. And we we'll be able to find out what the height is. Now we actually have to calculate tan 30. If you go over though to your table, you'll see that tan 30, which is the same as pi over 6, is one of the few angles that we can know directly from a table. So it is actually the same thing as radical 3 over 2. But you know what? Let's just use a calculator here. It would be the same thing as 1 over radical 3. And that's still too hard to use, so let me punch it into the calculator. 500 divided by radical 3 equals 288 feet. And that is how we figure out the height of the rocket, or if we have a flagpole or a building or even the Great Pyramid, we can figure out its height. We need the angle and we need the baseline. All right, that is it for this lesson. The next lesson we'll talk about sine and cosine and how we can use that. But for now, the best thing to do is to go over these vocabulary words of what sine is, what cosine is, what tangent is, and to see if you can remember these relationships. And if you need to, you can use the SOA, COA, TOA words, which is kind of crazy, but it's helpful. Useful. Bye-bye. And remember to